All right, Craig, I've been away for a few weeks. I heard something is going on in Syria. So, what's going on? Have I missed out on anything?
Yeah. Well, yes, you've missed out on the disappearance of a country in about 3 days. Syria doesn't exist any longer. It's gone. It's been partitioned between Israel, Turkey, and the United States. Israel's got the southern part. Turkey's got the northern part, and the United States has got the oil part. And we always go for the money. The question I have is how come the Syrian army didn't fight? Because previously the Syrian army, with Russian air support, had easily defeated this same force. But curiously, this time, the Syrian army never fought. They withdrew from Aleppo. They withdrew from Hamas. They withdrew from Damascus. They never showed any battlefield resistance. And this is the way that the terrorist group, which we at the moment call the Syrian Democratic Opposition, it's what is this group? It's originally ISIS, Al Qaeda, then Al Nusra, then the Syrian Democratic Opposition, or this HT, whatever, or H something. It's three initials I've already forgotten because it'll be something else tomorrow.
Do you have any ideas as to why they didn't fight the invasion?
I do. I assume that Washington paid the Syrian generals not to fight, which is something we do all the time. We purchase the enemy, or we purchase the government, or so on. But John Hilmer, who has been reporting from Moscow for a long, long time, at least 25 years, he says that a deal was worked out between Russia, Turkey, the U.S., and Israel to sell out Assad. And Helmer reports that the Iranians asked, or that actually Assad asked for Russian troops, and Iran wanted to send the Revolutionary Guards, and but first of all, Putin refused any help to Assad, which is curious after fighting for Syria for 9 years, that Putin simply turned his back and walked away and left them at the mercy of America and Israel and Turkey. And the Iranians don't seem to have done what they could have done. There was this agreement, the Astana agreement. Russia was real keen on it. You may remember that when Obama was going to invade Syria, the Russian Air Force showed up first, which preempted the American invasion.
Was that in 2016, or when was that exactly?
Yeah, about then. I can't remember. But it's been 9 years. So that would be 2016, yeah, of thereabouts, so 15, 16.
Right.
And but the Russians, they never finish what they start. And they left the province where the Americans were stealing the oil, and that's where Washington had its jihadists, its CIA mercenaries that had been beaten back. And the Astana agreement left them there. Now, that's the province from which this overthrow of Syria has just happened. It happened in 2 or 3 days. That's all it took. 2 or 3 days for a country that had been victorious against the same forces and that Russia had been defending for 9 years, fell in the most 3 days without fighting.
How long do you think it would take to work out such an agreement between the named countries about?
Well, this Astana agreement was a multi-year thing the Russians were keen on. Putin prefers agreements to war, and but he doesn't seem to understand that he's making agreements that serve the enemy, not Russia, like the Minsk agreement. So Putin repeated the folly of the Minsk agreement with the Astana agreement. You can read about it online. It's Astana. There's a long history of it in Wikipedia. Now, I don't trust Wikipedia because it's part of the control the narrative, slander the good guys. But sometimes just events get accurately enough reported. And even if it isn't all that accurate, at least you can see how long it's been going on and that the Russians were a prime sponsor of it.
What about this agreement between Turkey and the other countries that you mentioned about taking the country in 3 days?
Well, I don't know if they knew it'd be in 3 days, but see why did Turkey get into it? Because he ended up double crossing Putin and Syria and Iran. It seems that what the Turkish leaders saw in this was a solution to the Kurd problem. The Kurds have been a thorn in Turkey's side for a long time, and Turkey has been occupying part of northern Syria for a long time, trying to put down the Kurds or prevent their formation of a state or prevent the ones outside of Turkey from helping those inside Turkey. And, there's been sort of an internal conflict going on between Kurds and Turkey for a long time. So the Turkish leader saw in this deal a chance to get to the Kurds and finish them off. And because the Kurds were technically under American protection, though we didn't do anything, it was just us to show our human rights flag, you know. So that explains Turkey. Now, I've seen conflicting indications of whether Iran sold out Syria too, or whether Iran didn't expect the Russians not to prevent it, and therefore didn't take initiative itself to be prepared. I don't know. But the fact is, it is an amazing strategic defeat for Russia and Iran. It's amazing. And for Putin to engineer his own defeat, it's inexplicable. I don't think he realizes that he has dramatically reduced his image, his credibility, the chances for BRICS. The way the world works is people line up with the biggest battalions, and the people who have the biggest battalions are not the ones who are always being defeated. So I think the rush to join BRICS by other countries, the growing influence of Russia, all that I think has been damaged.
That's going to strengthen the U.S. dollar, of course.
It's going to, yeah, and what we'll also see is, recently Saudi Arabia was holding military exercises with Iran, which is unheard of. And Saudi Arabia had canceled the petrodollar. It said we accept payment in other currencies. Well, now I suspect what you'll see is Saudi Arabia will reinstate the petrodollar in exchange for American protection. You may remember some years ago, the neoconservatives called for the overthrow of 7 countries in 5 years, and they named them, Iraq and Libya and Syria and and now and then you may remember the General Wesley Clark, the NATO commander, went on television and said he was at the Pentagon, and the generals called him in and said, "Sir, we've gotten orders to prepare to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years."
And he described that on Democracy Now! And he said that this took place a few weeks after 9/11, after they began bombing Afghanistan, which took place on the 7th of October.
Well, the first calls were in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the neocons saw that there was no longer constraint on American hegemony in the Middle East. And so that was the first. It was the editor of the Jewish magazine. The magazine's called Commentary, and the editor was Norman Podhoretz. And he first spelled out the scenario. And then the neoconservatives in the government, they had a think tank, the New American, something of the prospects for the New American Century or something like that, and they called also for this
Project for the New American Century.
Yeah, Project for the New American Century. That's it. So what we see now, there's only 2 countries left. The rest of them are gone. And of course, Saudi Arabia has lost its buffer, which was Syria. And also, Syria was the route through which Saudi Arabia could reinforce Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is the only force that was keeping Israel from occupying Lebanon. So in one fell swoop, they've got Syria and Lebanon. It's just a question which one Israel eats up first. And we have a situation now where the Israelis, and this information is a day or two old, have conducted 460 or 480 air attacks on Syrian depots where weapons were, on Syrian plants that make weapons. And so what's happened, they have completely annihilated the terrorists who have taken over. They've annihilated their ability to have any weapons. So now what you're going to see happen is this. The Democratic opposition is very quickly going to become, again, terrorists. Israel will have to fight the terrorists, and the fighting of the terrorists is the way Israel will occupy Syria. And they will say they have to be there to protect themselves. But of course, they'll never leave. And once they manage this, there goes Lebanon. They need North Lebanon for a place to put the Palestinians.
They talked about transporting them to the Congo at one point.
Well, the Congo may not want them. But I think, and I don't think, we'll put pressure on Egypt. But what Israel really wants from Lebanon is the southern part, because that's where the river is. They want the water resource. So the northern part around Beirut could just become a massive refugee center. And they could park them all there, and then the UN and the West has to support them indefinitely.
So basically what you're saying is that the invasion of Palestine subsequent to the October 7 attacks and what we're seeing here are probably not independent events, but they are probably all interconnected.
They're all interconnected. I've always been suspicious that the Hamas attack, when they allegedly breached the wall, this had to have been an Israeli orchestration. I don't mean that Hamas didn't do it, but it had to have been made possible for them to do. They probably not only let them, they probably infiltrated Hamas. and told them that, hey, we've got it set up now. We know how to breach it, so we can attack now. And so Hamas was probably deceived by infiltrators into this. But of course, it served Israel's purpose, which is to completely annihilate the existence of Palestine. No more West Bank, no more Gaza.
So, Craig, how can Israel, with such a small population, occupy such a large area?
Yes, that's a very good question. I've wondered that myself, Soren. How is Greater Israel, a vast territory, to be occupied? And I was wondering, the Muslims have historically been split since the 7th or 8th century, and the Shia and the Sunni, they don't get along. They hate each other, I think, worse than they hate their external enemies. And so maybe the plan for Israel is to use the Sunni to occupy the Shia, or the Shia to occupy the Sunni. In other words, Israel will use the Muslims to occupy the Muslims. And there you see the helplessness of the Muslim because of this historic split that prevents unity. And so the absence of unity is the way the West has controlled the Middle East for a long time.
I wonder about the casualty figures of the recent bombings in Syria. In Palestine, there was an estimate in the Lancet, because in the Western media they only talk about the number of deaths from violence, but the number of indirect deaths from war-imposed deprivation is usually 4 or 5 times higher. And the paper in the Lancet estimated about 186,000 deaths. And that number has subsequently been revised to perhaps close to 300,000 by now.
Well, see, the world has stood aside while the Israelis murdered 200,000 or 300,000 people, partly from bombs and missiles, and partly from malnutrition, disease because there are no hospitals left, polluted water. People are now dying for a variety of reasons, and probably at a higher rate than from the bombs and missiles or the machine guns. So the world did stand aside for a couple of 100,000 people murdered. Will it stand aside for 2 million? We don't know, but may. So Israel may succeed in killing them off simply because there's no medicine, there's no hospitals, there's no food, people are starving, the water's polluted. So this is another way to get rid of populations. I think it's throughout history that serious wars, more people die from non-combat wounds.
An excellent source is Francesca Albani's report called Anatomy of a Genocide. She works for the UN, and she documented the horrors, the torture, the systematic bombing of hospitals. That is an excellent resource and provided relief to, the silence from the mainstream media at this point. They don't talk about it any longer, what's happening there, what's not happening there, and so on.
You see, it's anti-Semitic disinformation. And the Western countries, including the U.S., are busy passing laws that put you in jail if you say anything critical of Israel or of Jews. So, it'll be impossible to talk about without going to prison. And like the Holocaust, you can't discuss that or produce any findings without going to prison. So I don't think there's really any constraint on Israeli behavior, and I think they can do whatever they want to do. I think that's what has been demonstrated by their attack on Palestine. And in Syria, or what was once Syria. There are videos now available. I posted some showing the democratic opposition machine gunning down Syrians. They're hanging people. They're just shooting them down. And who are these people? I mean, I don't know. They can't all be Assad's relatives. So, are they Israel? Are they Assyrian soldiers, the ones who didn't fight, and really no reason to kill them because they were forced to stand down? I don't know. I don't know why Putin. You see, John Hilma reports, and I haven't had a chance to study the latest report, but he says that Putin refused to protect Syria from the Israeli Air Force.
Where can we read his reports?
On my site, I'll link to them, or
So those on the guest columns.
I'll probably publish a major summary this Sunday. It'll be on my website. It's just www.paulcraigroberts.org, or you can find it on John Hilma's own site. It's called Dancing with Bears. I don't know whether it's a paid site or not. He says that Putin was far more protective of Israel than of Syria, and therefore made the decision to sell out Syria. Apparently, Putin is scared to death to have an Israeli plane shot down, and would never allow Syria to use the Russian air defenses in Syria to protect itself from these constant Israeli attacks. So it was a funny situation here where the Russians were in Syria fighting against the American-supported terrorists, but Israel had complete impunity to attack the Syrian forces because Putin was too afraid of Israel to knock out the Air Force, which he could have done easily. I mean, the Russians could have completely wiped out the Israeli Air Force without any trouble. But he wouldn't even let one shot be fired at them. So there's something in Putin's mind about Israel.
Russia has a significant Jewish population. Could that be a factor?
No, of course not, because the Russian Muslim population is many, many times greater. And it's the few Jews in Russia are nothing compared to the Muslim populations that are part of the Russian Federation. I mean, he's got them fighting for him in Ukraine, the Chechens. So here he is relying on Muslims to fight for him in Ukraine while he sells out the Syrian.
It's a huge defeat for BRICS, because how can they rely on Russia now to defend them? How can they trust his word? We're going to protect you from American aggression, Israeli aggression. Well, they can't trust him now. So
that's true, and what that also means is neither can Iran. And now people have forgotten, but Iran now has a reformist government. A reformist government. Now, what does it mean, reformist? It means it wants to loosen things up. It wants less religious control over government, over the behavior of the young, over the young women, over the young men. And so what is happening, I think, in Iran is the new government is going to say, look, we're isolated. We can't trust the Russians. We've lost our buffers. We're isolated. Saudi Arabia, of course, has never been allied with us, and whatever moves we were making, they will now go back to the Americans for protection. So we must accommodate the West. So you will see, I think, the reformist government in Iran, that is, the ones who are pro-Western, who are more attracted by an open, morally loose culture than the hardline religious standards. that the Ayatollah in Iran is, represents and enforces as best he can. And so they'll say, well, we have to accommodate the West. And now this may disappoint Trump's anti-Iranian appointees. It may disappoint Israel, and they may decide not to be accommodated because they'd rather attack. Or they would rather just get rid of Iran rather than to have an accommodating government, just to have control. I don't know, but I do think that the collapse of Soviet and Iranian power was dramatically quick. And it looks like, according to John Hilmer, that Putin himself was responsible for the collapse of Russian power and prestige. I don't see any other way you can see it.
What were the main factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, if you could briefly summarize them?
Oh, well, that was because Gorbachev, the president, formerly he would have been the general secretary of the Communist Party, but he was also moving toward Western ways and wanted to be president. He was moving so fast in liberalizing relations with the West that it alarmed the Politburo, the top ruling communist. You had the Central Committee, then you had the Politburo. And the hardliners and the Politburo were alarmed that Gorbachev was making too many concessions too quickly to Washington and wasn't being careful and wasn't proceeding in a careful way that it wouldn't come back to bite them. And so they placed him under house arrest. So when the Politburo arrested the president of Russia, I mean, they didn't put him in prison, but they had him under house arrest. This created the opportunity for Yeltsin and for the Russian dissidents, which had been accumulating because of the opposition to the communist way of governing, the way of never having anything in the economy. The people were more economically oppressed than politically. And so that's what caused the collapse when they arrested Gorbachev. So the hardliners in Russia arrested the liberalizer. Now the same thing could happen in Iran. The reformist government, if they go too far, may find themselves Revolutionary Guard may arrest them. I can't say. I'm not Iranian. And it's very difficult to get any good information because most of the West won't even let the Iranian news service exist. So you can't even find out what the narrative is. And so that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of people think, oh, Reagan defeated them. Reagan collapsed them. Well, this happened 3 or 4 years after Reagan was gone from office.
What about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? Did that play into the collapse of the Soviet Union?
No, that was way back in the 70s. So that was Carter. That was in the Carter years. That was long ago, before Reagan. The Soviet collapse was simply, you see, when Gorbachev was a liberalizer. And so this was undermining the belief in the old system because the own president was making rapid changes. And so, and the old system was already under attack, and now the president is further undermining belief in it by trying to change it and proceeding rapidly. And it alarmed the Politburo, and they arrested him. They overestimated the support they had. And Yeltsin came up. And, of course, he very quickly became an American puppet. because the Soviets had been brainwashed about democracy in America and human rights and how wonderful, and they were so naive and unaware that they fell into our clutches, and we expected them to stay there. Everyone thought that Putin would be a continuation of Yeltsin because he was Yeltsin's chosen successor. Then Yeltsin was perfectly amenable to Western-controlled Russia, which the West had. I think the way Putin became independent or partially independent was that the neoconservatives got so busy with their wars in the Middle East, they weren't paying much attention. And they were surprised in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference when Putin announced that he did not accept American unipolarism or American unilateralism, that Russia had her own interest and would be pursuing her interest. Well, that's when we turned on him. And the first thing, we trained the Georgian army and sent them into South Ossetia. Then we started pouring money into Ukraine. Victoria Nuland said that we poured in $5 billion, creating division within Ukraine, creating allies for American coup, creating political allies. And then we had the Maidan Revolution. And so this is all the payback for Putin's getting off the reservation.
It seems that all the recent developments, and if we go back, all of it eventually is going to strengthen the dollar again. Do you predict that the dollar is going to become much stronger over the next few years?
Well, there's so much that can happen we don't know about, such as no one expected the collapse of the Assad government. But it is true that that countries were moving away from the use of dollar as reserve currency. The percentage of dollars that constituted the reserves of foreign central banks was falling. Russia no longer has them. China was selling off its massive reserves of U.S. treasuries. BRICS was trying to create a new payments mechanism that it did not in any way use dollars or have anything to do with the Western clearance mechanisms. I think all of this is now on hold, and Saudi Arabia had canceled the petrodollar. I think they will try to restore that in exchange for a return to American protection, because they've seen the great weakening of Russia and Iran, and so they don't feel like they can afford to be free of the Americans. So all of these things will make the dollar attractive again, because much of the turnaway was based on hope or on expectations that the correlation of forces in the world had changed and were running in favor of Russia and China and the Muslims in the Middle East. That Israel was hemmed in finally, that the American influence in the area was failing. The Americans couldn't even deal with the Houthis. The Israelis couldn't even deal with Hezbollah. It all looked like a transformation in the correlation of forces away from the West to the East. Well, all that's been wiped out in 3 days. It's inexplicable that Russia and Iran allowed that, because it's to their disadvantage. And I think it's really damaged Putin's leadership. John Helmer reports that Putin and the Russian commanders are under tremendous criticism. inside Russia, from news programs, from colonels, from officers, from nationalistic Russians who don't want to be globalist and friends to the West or all that. That Putin's position is eroded, not greatly, but some. So this constant rise he's had is now he's kind of tipped back over. Well, that's not a good thing because, the neoconservatives have always thought they could destabilize Putin by causing defeats. That was the whole purpose of the Ukrainian coup that Washington pulled off. It was to put Putin under the spotlight, Oh, what were you doing? Why did you let the Americans overthrow Ukraine? So now he's essentially evicted from the Middle East. No one knows what's going to happen to the Russian air bases and naval bases in Syria. Now, here's the really funny part, the paradox, the irony. The Russian Foreign Ministry at this time is conducting negotiations with the terrorist group that took over, which in Russia is on the list of terrorist organizations. So Russia is negotiating with terrorists for the protection of Russian bases. Now, you think, apparently this hasn't occurred to the foreign ministry how embarrassing this is, that Russia's having to appeal to people that it denounces as terrorists to protect its bases. And you see, the Syrian air bases, I think, were also the jump-off place for the Russian activities in Africa. So if they lose these air bases, they're kind of thrown out of Africa. So the whole thing that Putin had going, which was so promising, I think, has bit the dust. So what is the conclusion? It's not just that two countries have disappeared at the end of 2024. It's that the situation has gone so strongly against Putin and Iran that it's probably now impossible for Trump to make any concessions in trying to settle the activities in Ukraine because the West is on a roll. So why is Trump going to make any concessions? And so his demands are going to be more than Putin can afford to agree to. But the pressure will be on Trump to have an American victory, not a defeat. So the hope that this could be resolved, I think, is diminished. And Putin is now reaching the point, because of all the provocations, that he's either going to have to finally fight or surrender. So the question in my mind for 2025 is whether Putin fights or surrenders. Now, Putin knows that a nuclear war would be devastating. Nobody would win. Everything would be ruined. And so he may prefer to surrender. But he never put his foot down when he could have stopped the provocations before they became so serious. You see, as soon as Syria fell, what happened? We tested the waters and sent more missiles into Russia to see what happens. Well, he didn't attack anybody in the West. He attacked Ukraine again. He did. He's just done what he should have done the first day of the Russian intervention. Knocking out the power bases that let Kiev function and continue the war. So he's 3 years late doing what he should have done on the first day. Well, this is not a response to missiles flying into Russia. So the West is seeing he's unwilling to actually respond. So they'll keep provoking. And they could go too far and cause a nuclear response, or they could simply quit. And I think that's the question before us.